I wanted to, welcome you to our Black History Month edition of Insights Offsite. We have some exquisite panelists with us today, moderated by Kwaku. I'll allow them to introduce themselves in a moment, but just so everyone's aware of kind of the agenda for today, we'll be starting off with a panel on inclusive research techniques, and then we'll be moving into another panel on Black culture and the future of media. And that will kick off at noon Pacific time, 3 p.m. Eastern. With that said, there will likely be some time for question and answers towards the end of the session. So feel free to, send your questions in via the Q&A, and Kwaku and I can, take a look at them and make sure we get your questions answered. But with that, I'll pass it over to Kwaku and let him kick this off.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well today. Also, happy Black History Month. I would like to also welcome you to this panel because it's going to be something that I think is going to be useful in your careers moving forward. The name of the panel is Inclusive Research Techniques. And again, as Rohan mentioned, my name is Kwaku Pokusama-Adjaman. I'm the moderator, and here's a little bit about myself. I have 14 years of experience in research. I'm currently a consumer insights manager at Disneyland Resort. I'm truly passionate about cultural inclusive research. And not only do I think this panel will help, but it will also help the people who consume your research. So given the state of society today, it is clear that conducting research with inclusivity in mind is going to be an important aspect to the research industry going forward. As you all have seen, inclusivity is one of the top buzzwords for companies and organizations globally. I'm really excited to jump into the discussion. We have a great panel here that will share with you their experience with inclusive research, while also imparting techniques that will be useful to you and your organization. With that, let's jump into the discussion and introduce our panelists. I'll quickly state, panelists, as you introduce yourself, please give us your perspective on what role you feel inclusive research plays in today's environment, and also give you the order. So first, we'll start with Melva Benoit, who is CEO and founder of Marion Dupree Group. Next, we'll have Matthew Barnhill, who is founder and consultant at Consumer Sense. After Matthew, we'll have Stacey DeArmas, who is SVP of Diverse Consumer Insights at Nielsen. And rounding up the end will be Mario Carrasco, founder of Think Tank. So I'll hand it to Melva. The floor is yours.
Okay, hello, everyone. Great to be here. So I'll give you sort of the very sort of short version of me and where I come from. The majority of my career has been spent in media research, particularly in entertainment brands. So from King World to Cartoon Network, I'll just touch all of them, Disney, Fox, NBC, Nickelodeon, and Comedy Central. In all of those experiences, I was always one of one, meaning the only person of color in the research department, and usually the only woman. Most of the time on the senior leadership team, I was the only person of color. Because my beginning started with kids, inclusivity or diversity was a huge part of how we did research. A third of the sample, because we were dealing with kids, was always diverse. And so we just sort of blanketed a third of the sample. Over time, as I moved from kids, the first 11 years in kids and then the next 10 years working in adults, because of who I am, I always made it a point to make sure that my team was multicultural. So I had a little bit of everything on my team, because that meant that they understood how to talk to people that went beyond just who we are. And when I was at Fox, in the last part of my time in corporate, in 2009, we decided to make diversity an imperative in content creation. So diversity was a part of business. We knew that America was getting browner. And so basically Peter Liguori, who was the president of the network at the time, told every producer, we were not picking up your show unless there was diversity in front of and behind the camera. And I had to stand up there and talk about what it meant from television viewing and having non-white eyes view your content, what that meant to your success. So because of that, I've always made sure that we've had a portion of our sample represent non-white viewers. What's happened now is with millennials, language has changed, and I'll stop after this. And now it goes even further, because how you talk to people and how you think of how you survey people and ask people questions, it changes how they identify themselves, et cetera. So there are other things that need to happen. I'll stop there because I could talk all day. So I'll let Matthew go.
Okay, thanks, Melba. My name is Matthew Barnhill, and I'm very excited to be here. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I currently run a business called Consumer Sense, and we're a boutique market research agency focused in on multicultural research. Prior to this, I was at BET Networks, a division of Viacom, where I founded the research department and led it for many, many years. I think that it's very important to have inclusive research for a number of reasons. One, yeah, I did work at BET, and yes, we did sample African Americans, of course. But what we found with a lot of advertisers and clients is the misperception that African Americans are monolithic or behave the same way as white consumers. And that's just simply not true in many categories and product areas. So I think it's very important to make sure that you have a wide lens, or cast a big net, if you will, to make sure that you aren't missing any potential business opportunities. So making sure that you have a fully diverse sample or consumer set is absolutely critical today if you want to be in the multicultural space. And that's it for me. I'll turn it over to Stacey.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Matthew and Melba. I'm happy to be with you all here today. And Kwaku, thank you too also for the invitation. My name is Stacey de Armas, and I work with Nielsen. At Nielsen, I look after the area of our business that is diversity, equity, and inclusion, but very specifically on new products and product development and inclusive insights and research. I have been with Nielsen since '98, so I've had a very long career in diversity research. It's been my passion point actually since before I joined Nielsen, and I was at an ad agency. I am a first generation Latina Cubana, born and raised in Los Angeles. And I have had really a remarkable opportunity to be part of this business, at least diversity research, specifically focusing on the Hispanic consumer early in my career, now focusing on a very expansive set of different identity groups. But it has been a great opportunity to be part of the growth of the industry, and not just because it has it's good for us all, right, and because it gives us more insights and research, but because I think it's a really important forward progress for society. Melva mentioned earlier the importance of who is in front of and behind the camera. It has been a privilege also to work on a new piece of research at Nielsen we're calling inclusion analytics, which blends our Nielsen audience data, which many people are familiar with, who's watching, along with who is in the content and who is on screen as another metric to evaluate content. So we'll talk hopefully more about that, but thank you for having me here. And I'll turn it over to Mario.
Hey, thanks everyone. And thanks again for having me. My name is Mario Carrasco. I'm co-founder of Think Now. We are a multicultural research firm helping brands, government, and agencies understand consumers from diverse backgrounds. We also own and operate one of the largest independently owned multicultural panels. So I'm really glad to hear Melva and Matthew talk about the importance of sample. That's really a passion point of mine. So prior to founding Think Now, I was at an agency called Garcia Research. I was hired there to build what became one of the first representative Hispanic online panels. Then that company was subsequently purchased by another firm. And at that time, my business partner and I decided that, the opportunity and that multicultural consumers present is much too large to just, be part of a department in a larger company. So we really wanted to build Think Now to have a whole company focus on multicultural consumers. So I've been in the multicultural research space, specifically in sample, a little bit over 15 years. Here I think now we've expanded our panel to include not only US Hispanic consumers, but African American and Asian consumers. And really, you know, a lot of what we've been thinking about, and I think we'll touch on this panel, is how the sample industry was really constructed with the one specific consumer in mind. When you think about how we incentivize, how we communicate, Melva pointed how we ask questions, even double opt-in email. It's a very specific consumer in mind. So, you know, really excited to talk about how we can make the sample industry and subsequently the research industry more inclusive.
Awesome. Thank you, Mario. Thank you, everyone, for giving your bios. We definitely have the right people for this panel, if I may say. So for this next portion of this discussion, excuse me, I've prepared 4 questions for the panelists. And so the first one's going to go to Mario. Let's talk about bias in research. We recognize that all people have biases. There's really no way of getting around it. This has been well documented and studied. However, we also know that our own biases impact our perceptions of others, ultimately how we collect the data. The way we define diversity is influenced by the problem that we're trying to solve. So with that said, the question is, what methods or practices do you implement to ensure your research is inclusive? In addition, what is your approach to defining diverse groups within your research studies?
So glad I got this question. I know it was randomized, but appreciate you setting that up, Kwaku. So this is something we think about a lot. And I mean, we talk about research, it's so broad, right? You have qualitative, you have quantitative research, but I want to focus in on a specific example that I think the pandemic has really brought to light. Been talking to a lot of companies that have switched their qualitative research from in-person to online. And that has actually been a bright spot during the pandemic. This has enabled qualitative research to actually be more inclusive. Because when you think about traditional qualitative research, I'm talking about old school in-person focus groups, again, it had a very traditional, a very specific consumer in mind, right? When are qualitative research groups typically set up? After traditional work hours, right? 9 to 5. But when you look at Black and Latinx consumers, we're 60% more likely to have non-traditional work hours than non-Hispanic whites, right? So immediately just things like time, things that we take for granted about setting up a time to have a focus group, we already have this bias built in. So that's one thing that we look at a little bit differently. How can we schedule focus groups time to be more inclusive? Another thing, incentives, right? Again, you have a very specific consumer in mind when engaging in focus groups, and incentives are nominal, right? It's assuming that you're going to come in after work, a traditional 9 to 5. But when you look at Black and Latinx consumers, I mean, and talk about during the pandemic, how we've been impacted from an economic perspective, simple things of like increasing incentives to get that representation are things that we implement even pre-pandemic to make sure we get more inclusive consumers. And also just having online focus groups really makes it more inclusive, right? There's getting someone to drive to a focus group facility. If you're talking to parents, you got to deal with things like childcare, automobile, etc. So looking at the pandemic, again, people are now able to do it at home, not necessarily have to get childcare. So I hope some of the things that we've been doing as a result of the pandemic continue, because it has lent itself to be more inclusive.
That's great. That's great. Do any of you have anything to add to what Mario has said? If not, I have a follow-up for you. So in terms of the switch from in-person to online, do you feel that you're getting richer data, or what is the output? Is the output better How are you seeing in terms of the results that you're getting?
I wouldn't say that the output is better. I think that the response rates are better. I think that we've been able to talk to consumers that were maybe difficult to get in a traditional in-person setting, like I mentioned. But I wouldn't say the output is better. I think it's more diverse. So from that perspective, it's better, right? It's in the sense that it's more representative. And I guess maybe I would qualify that. I think people are you know, one thing I have noticed is like longing to have those conversations, and so or just conversations in general. So from that perspective, I think people are a little bit more open to engage with moderators. So that, you know, another bright spot in the pandemic, that people are more likely to engage, give a little bit more color when moderators are asking questions.
I'd have to echo what he just said. In doing some online focus groups or one-on-one interviews, what I found is that younger consumers are much more willing to be open and honest. And, you know, it could be just they're used to technology and you know, communicating via cell phone or a tablet. But the warm-up session that you typically have to get younger people to jump in and stop being shy, if you will, those go out the window, and consumers are ready to jump in and talk.
Yeah, I completely agree. Just having finished a couple of projects, what I found is people are in their own space. So in their own space, they're much more comfortable and they talk. We did groups where there were groups that were with Black folks and groups with white folks. White folks had a white moderator. I was the moderator for the Black folks. There was a much more comfortable conversation. Everybody spoke. So I don't see that, you know, there's always a leader in the groups, but everyone spoke. Everyone was in their own space, whether they were in the bed or wherever they were in their home. So they're happy to tell you whatever's on their mind. But what was remarkable to me in the white groups with the white moderator is they were brutally honest and basically had a comment about something that they would never have said in person. If they were all together in a room, all the things would have come up saying this is too PC to make this comment that they made in the groups. And I won't sort of repeat the comment. So I've found that, and I think it's important when you're talking about exclusivity to think about who's moderating, who they're talking to, because there is a comfort level that comes. There's everything from how we talk, the cadence that we get into and what we're talking about, to sort of, you know, it sort of pains me when a research company does research on multicultural and there's nobody multicultural basically conducting. There's nobody multicultural looking at the questions that they're asking. There's nobody moderating. And Matthew and I have talked about this. And then when they have data and they're sitting down, they're trying to understand why they're getting the response that they're getting, because there's no one, and this is the in front of and behind the camera moment, there's no one on the team that, you know, and I don't mean go get, you know, a Black guy from Harvard, because he sometimes sounds like the white guy from Harvard. I mean, there's no one on the team that basically comes with a diverse sort of experience. And so that to me is equally important.
Yeah, I would
bias. Mm-hmm.
I would completely agree. I think having a diverse team working on a project could help you get the insights that you need, because, you know, as Matthew mentioned earlier, you know, Black folks aren't a monolith. Same with any other group in the United States or globally. Melba, I love that you brought up that you had just, you know, done a focus group where you were able to see the differences in terms of people giving authentic answers. I think it sets up the next question very well. So to start with, you know, with this being Black History Month, I want to ask my next question in the context of the Black consumer. Research is not always easy because Black people don't have the highest level of trust for research. This is mainly because of historical factors that kind of build into this. In addition, even if we're able to recruit Black consumers, getting accurate responses may be difficult. For example, the simple art of code switching can impact your results, where an individual, based on who the moderator is going to give the response they feel the moderator should get. So while this is not limited just to Black consumers, the question I have here is, what is your process for reaching the right people? How do you ensure that your participants and respondents are providing authentic responses that can be turned into actionable results?
So that's interesting, because Matthew and I did some work together. What is it, 2 years now?
No, last year.
Was it last year? Oh my God.
Yeah.
No, year before
Oh,
last.
you're right. You're right. I know what you mean. 2 years. Yeah.
So, in my company, I'm not really a research consultant. We like to call ourselves an innovative insights company. I like to design research, and sometimes I will field, sometimes I'll moderate. But we were doing a project for a client, and it was the first time I was doing multicultural research, so I needed Matthew to have my back. He found the respondents, and as we were going back and forth, because I know he moderates, it's like, I think I'm going to moderate. He's like, you'll be fine. So it happened to be Black women. It happened to be a topic that is one of my favorite things. And what did we do? We did dyads. And what did we do? We did dyads and triads, in a living room environment in Atlanta. And it was just fun, because we did, how many? We did a lot of them.
Yeah.
Like 12 or 13 of them. It was a lot. I was exhausted. But it was fun because it was a rapport. It was very comfortable for them. They gave me more than they probably would have given someone else. Another one of our research partners, who was white, who was doing the quantitative part of this, was sort of, I mean, she had an interesting reaction to that part of the data collection, in that things were revealed that she would never have heard if we'd had a different, if we'd done it a different way. Would you say that, Matthew?
Yeah, I agree.
He has more experience on that side in the work that's happened for BET. For me, it's a little different. It's come in fits and starts, and it's been much more about me creating experiences that are immersive and forcing people into places where they interact and they touch consumers. So I go at it a little bit differently, because that's where you get closer to culture and you begin to understand and develop some empathy and begin to understand what you're getting back. But all of it depends on who your stakeholder is and what is it that you're trying to learn. And that kind of dictates how you lean into methodology. This was an interesting situation where the client was targeting African Americans, and when Black women. And when I went to present the findings, I was one of 2 Black people in the room, a room of 15 people, but they're targeting, and they've never had a Black person do research for them before. Go figure, right? I can let Matthew talk now. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, I think you have to, kind of split it up between quant and qual. So if you're doing quant, obviously you can pull a sample that's balanced on a couple of key demographics, whether it's income, education level, etc. But when you're doing qualitative, a trick that I have found that helps me ensure that I have rich discussion is to have people bring in their friends and do friendship dyads or triads quite a bit. It's very easy for someone to call a friend out if they're telling something that's not the truth or 100% accurate. It's very easy for the friend to call them out on their BS, if you will. So one methodology that I find or setup that I find is very helpful when doing qualitative is to have respondents bring in a friend and just bounce off of them.
I do want to add something I think Melva talked about, which was great in terms of the focus groups being a living room environment. I think one thing that we take for granted in Qual is, like, when you think about focus group facilities, right? And you have, Black and Latinx consumers show up, it's very corporate. It doesn't lend itself to you coming in and being open.
Right.
One thing, if you have access to like a living room environment, that's great. Another trick we've learned is having the moderator, hopefully that the respondents can identify with, but having the moderator there to greet them when they enter, it makes it a little bit more comfortable place, right? Because if you're just coming in to, most focus group facilities, they're beautiful, but they're not very, they're not necessarily friendly for Black and Latinx respondents.
Oh, thank you, Mario. One follow-up on that. I know from a qual standpoint, there are certain methods we can do to alleviate the risk of not getting the right answers. Do you guys feel there's a way to do it in a quant study? Is there a certain way that you can ask questions or certain ways you can approach it so that while you may not be able to get the authentic anecdote that you get from the in-person online view of an individual responding, is there a way to get that in a quantified format?
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Melba.
What we found over time is because language has changed, because people text more, because that's happened, I started working around with the methodology that used a chat, a conversation, as a way to go through. And what I found is when you work really hard, when you first learn survey design, and I've been doing this for almost 30 years. Oh my God, I said it out loud. When you first learn survey design, it's very academic and very rigid, and you're taught to write a question. It's like, if I want to ask you if you like something, I'm never going to ask you, do you like it? I'm going to ask you, thinking about, in this very sort of way that we don't normally communicate anymore. So we've been working a lot to kind of deconstruct the survey and sort of make it a little bit more straightforward, if you will. After going through sort of conversation, I began to sort of see that, you have to speak in people's language, especially when you're talking about quant, because you're not there with them. It's not like it's a telephone survey and they can ask you, what do you mean by that word, right? And so you have to sort of make sure that the interpretation is, it's like any email that you send out where you're like, oh, how many times have we gotten mad about text? Because it's like, you don't know what the person means. I think that's the biggest challenge that we come away with. And so we're starting to play around with language. I know I'm playing around with language much more, playing around with syntax, playing around a little bit with how you become a little bit more conversational. Because we don't, the English language, it's not the one that I learned back in school. People don't talk that way anymore,
Oh, go ahead, Stacy.
I was just going to say, we've been, I'm sitting here listening and it's been so valuable for me to hear so much how we're really approaching, focus groups and the detail on that qualitative components. And I think about the work that we do, at Nielsen, which probably feels perhaps big and impersonal. And, but then I also think about what, Matthew said when he was talking about, being in our living rooms. And I think it was Matthew, right, or Mario, but, sort of being in the living room and the work that we do at Nielsen in collecting people's behaviors, right, if we can just simplify it, in their living rooms, in their comfort zone, the content that they're consuming, and how much that ends up telling us about people and their experience. We released a piece of work just last week where we talked a little bit about, and so it feels very quantitative focused, right? Like what Black family and the changes that Black families have had to endure and the experiences over the course of the last year and how we're seeing that in behaviors. And one of the really interesting things that I was thinking about as I was listening to you all talk was in our quant research, right? We saw something that told us more about what's happening qualitatively. We saw that, for example, for the week of January 6th, that when you look at all children 2 to 17 compared to Black children 2 to 17, their top 10 shows, you would imagine that among those top shows, there'd be, it would be mostly children's programming, right? Cartoons, things like that. And in fact, It was among total adults, total kids that we looked at. It was the top 10 shows were all kids content consumed, with one news programming coming in. We all remember what happened the week of January 6th. But when we looked at Black children, we saw something really surprising that gave us that additional insight, right? And this is without doing this is because this is happening in the living room. We saw that among those top 10 shows, right, mixed in with cartoons and really, kids content, 4 of the top 10 were straight hard news programs. And one of the insights, this is why it's so important to have, diverse teams too. One of the insights that came from that without even a second of thought was, you know what, my Black colleague said to us, Black people can't afford to not be informed, including our kids. Like, this is a family. We need, we need to consume this content and learn. But what that piece of Quant gave us was all of this direction for doing additional qualitative research and insights where we could better understand some of those building blocks that make this a reality in this space. And we know what those are, but being able to pin that down with data. And so, as I'm thinking about having the right people in the room and design and tools and the technology that we use, when we need to scale something, right? We can't have 17 people in a room and ask them, but we need to take what we have in this sort of rigid format and be able to extract those insights. How we can, how we can do better by having the right voices in the room, the right eyes in the room, and the right eyes into projects and insights. So I just wanted to add that piece.
That's great. And Matthew, I'm not sure, were you about to speak? I think it segues into Matt's next question, where, we are, after the summer, after, the events of George Floyd's tragic passing, what we saw is many companies were rushing to gather data on Black consumers. And what they found is that the data they had collected, or data they had in their internal databases, were not actionable for the Black population. To put it plainly, as a colleague of mine has said, the way the data was collected was consistently inconsistent. So when we talk about inclusive research, I think one of the things that people have a fear of is that, there are blind spots. They're not able to account for everything that is happening. And so, Mavi, my question to you is, how do we ensure that inclusivity is built into the research process? What methods can we put in place to ensure that we're covering our blind spots? How do we prepare or better prepare for current and future studies? I guess the best way to put this, how do we prepare for the inevitable changes that are going to happen to society, when we create and build research?
Yeah, I have to first go back to a point that Melvin made, which is making sure that your research team or somebody on the team is from a diverse background. Whether they are part of your team or whether you hire them, they need, if you are truly concerned about multicultural research, you need to have someone from those cultures to be able to add conjecture, anecdotes, a number of things that are qualitative in nature that you just won't get from the quant. So that's number one. I think that's absolutely critical. I think, though, it's a lot of this is really around the mindset of leadership. So right now, big data is the big thing, and lots of companies are investing a lot more heavily into analytics. And so that's kind of cool because it tells you what's happening with the behavior, but you're not going to get the why without the market research. So I think it's very important to make sure that your upper management understands clearly the value of the segment or consumer audience that you're talking about. Whether you build a business case to show what their buying power is, or whether you build a case based on real consumers and their experiences, I think there are ways to help move the needle for executives and key decision makers. So, but the thing about the blind spot is you don't know what you don't know. So it's tough. The biggest thing is to cast a wide net.
Yeah, if I could add, Matthew's absolutely right. The other thing is, and it was the first question around sample, I guess about 4 or 5 years ago, I started to revisit sample, because usually we say, oh, make a third of it minority. And when did we announce the new majority? When did we announce that the majority is going to become the minority 2040? We announced that it's more than 10 years ago. We said that that's the way the population is trending.
Yep.
And so I started to look at, you know, what we would typically do if the sample size was 300, then I would lop off a third of that to diverse, right? And that diverse was everybody, not white. That, you know, isn't enough to basically represent those other groups. So I said, you know, we know so much about the majority. We need to actually go the other way and double up on those other groups, because those other groups are not monoliths. So we should be 2/3 minority in the sample and a third majority, right? So that I have enough data, because what we're beginning to understand is that we are much more connected. We're much more, once you strip away race, and then you just start to look at sort of behaviors and how we cluster much more. I mean, how many of us like French food? How many of us like this? How many of us like that? It's like when you remove race, it's like the clusters look really different. So I thought, we're going to, at some point, the industry is going to have to take a step back, and it can't be enough to say, oh, a third of the sample. Well, just make sure if it's 1,000 people, make sure you at least have 100 Black people there. Well, that's not going to help you. So the sample's got to get bigger. And if truth be told, the majority, the white portion of your sample needs to start to decline as those others sort of, as you fill in the others, if you're doing quant. Because at some point, that's when you begin to sort of, you know, as you go through data, take race out of it and then bring race back, suddenly it opens your eyes to, wait a minute, there are things that I didn't see in the data before. Because the old way to do it, because, you know, researchers like to put people in boxes, the old way to do it is say, oh, Black people represent this of the sample and their behavior is X, and this is how they answer the questions. Well, if we go back and strip race out and say, well, women are this, and here how people are, and then turn the lens on and say, well, how many of those people are Black? How many of those people are yellow? How many of those people are pink? I think you begin to have a different way to think about data, because the population is going to change. Unfortunately, there are just not that many people of color. You know, I left Fox. I was head of research at Fox. There hasn't been someone like me in that job since I left at any network, right? And so that's where we're going to have to sort of begin to figure those things out, because that part of the equation is not changing. The leadership has to evolve, as Matthew said.
You're so right. You're particularly right about heavying up on research on you know, minorities. Most specifically, it makes me think about when we think about the trends, right, and not just the diversification of America, but the fact that, generally speaking, people of color tend to be younger. They're sort of at the beginning of that life cycle acquisition, right? That where you have, if you look at it, other than demographic groups, but if you look at where people are in that life cycle trajectory, more specifically, they're, you know, Latinos, African American, Asian are on the younger end of that, where non-Hispanic whites tend to be sort of in the center of that, at sort of the top of that curve, right, getting ready. So as you have this community that's coming up in that life cycle acquisition curve, that's where brands, advertisers, content developers, you know, that's where everybody really should be focused, because those are the big acquisitions, the big life stages are forthcoming. And as those occur, those are, from a brand perspective, those are your spenders. Those are the people, the trend makers, the taste makers for everything. And I hadn't really quite thought about it until you said it like that, but it does make perfect sense to sort of switch that. And rather than doing a third, 2/3, you know, heavy up on the group that you really do need to understand. for the demographic revolution that is ahead of us, or really, frankly, that we're right at the beginning of.
Well, the other side of it is, and I didn't talk about something that my company is working on, is we just don't know enough in market research. We know about behavior in large groups, and you can say, oh, consumer spending, and Target Market News used to put out a lot of sort of usage data and all of that. But there's no big ongoing data on the groups that goes into culture and understanding. There isn't a lot of knowledge about Black women. There isn't a lot of knowledge about Black men, considering the impact that they have on the greater society, considering the impact that they have on the culture and everything going on. And there's a lot of education, I think, that has to happen among our colleagues that goes beyond sort of the stuff that comes out all the time about consumer behavior and all of that. And that stuff leads to culture, which gets to empathy, which gets to beginning to understand that, yeah, there's a lot more that has to happen. There's a lot more that has to happen.
All right. Well, hey, Stacy, in keeping with the events of this past summer and the push for companies to be more inclusive, to dig into their, more readily to dig into their inclusive data and understand it. We know that this phase is likely going to come to an end. How do you sell this research to your stakeholders? What are some methods you're using today to show how important inclusivity data or inclusive data is to the business? How do you show value when diversity isn't the trending and buzzword of the moment?
Thank you for that question. I will say it's something that I personally have been involved with at Nielsen for nearly my entire career, and it has been at times, a challenge internally and externally, right? Getting people to focus on this consumer, and not just on the insights that we get from this consumer, but why they should demand better of research companies like us and others in terms of what inclusive respondents look like, right? Even today, we've talked a little bit about African American, Hispanic, Asian, but really those buckets are, we opened the call talking about, Matthew talking about the Black community not being a monolith. And I know even, at Nielsen, we're working hard to really break those down and do much deeper and expansive identity groups, including Afro-Latinx and gender non-binary and gender non-conforming, whatever, right? Whatever group, we want to be able to bring this data down to a very granular level. And we are in many cases, and you'll see a lot more from that from us. But what is, your question specifically is, how do we get this to matter to clients? There's sort of two ways, right? And how do we sell it to them? Our first sell isn't the data, but it's the value and the idea, right? The idea, we talked, I think on one of our prep calls about sort of demonstrating the value to clients, not just the value in this particular consumer, but rolling that back, the value in inclusive research, why it matters that we have more granular sets than just Asian, why we look at Southeast Asian, East Asian, why we break that down, and we make sure that we have that representative sample, so that in a whole, so even if this client at this point or isn't quite ready to get in, and I can't understand why they wouldn't be at this time, but if they're not quite ready to get their feet wet, the sell then is the more inclusive all of the research is. The more inclusive we are, the better we represent East Asian, the better everyone within that sample is represented. And, that's sort of very straightforward. But in the new project, we talked a little bit today about in front of and behind the camera, it's very obvious that, yes, the industry, the media industry in particular, entertainment, brands, sort of everyone really seemed to come together and rally after the events of last year. We don't want to see that wane. So we are jumping in deep. And as a result, even of those events, we brought forward new granular ways to take a look at our data to further socialize the value, not just of diverse consumers, but the differences in behaviors and how to how brands should be talking to consumers. We think it's really important at Nielsen, so much so that we've developed a new product, a new group, and we are 100% focused on really breaking down those monoliths everywhere, and not just in TV ratings, which I think people most know Nielsen for, but really deeply in other sets that people perhaps don't know about Nielsen, where we're all the underlying data that feeds things that you see externally won't be based on these sort of big buckets anymore. I'm sure some of my colleagues on this panel can also speak to what they're doing specifically, even around focus groups and others. I imagine it's become a little bit easier dialogue, right, Melva and Matthew and Mario, a little bit easier dialogue, but that we shouldn't, how do we then continue the momentum and ensure that we don't just give them these great insights that they sit on, but they really activate and take some bold and courageous moves in the industry.
No, nicely put. I guess to kind of invoke some of the questions that folks have sent, how do we as an industry address the need for more DI researchers and create accountability where it currently doesn't exist? So while you're able to sell it to the client, is there a way to make it more accountable, to make it something that's kind of ingrained in the company culture from a research standpoint? What are some ways that we as researchers can make it, something that is ingrained in the way in which we do research?
Oh, well, I think when we're in those rooms, we have to both ask some of those really tough and uncomfortable questions of our own data, and we have to be willing to receive them too, right? And that's sort of, we just had a conversation the other day about a piece of work and Native American voices, and we have ourselves have to recognize, okay, we're making these decisions, but there's a voice here that we need that isn't ours. And so I think being willing to ask ourselves those tough questions and those of our colleagues and our mates in those settings will help us not only better our research, but build a culture through which these type of challenges aren't seen as challenges, but really as pathways to making our research better and our insights better.
Yeah, there's also a great organization started by Whitney Dunlop Fowler called Insights in Color to promote getting more diverse researchers into companies and really just be a community for researchers of color. They've developed a really great tool called Diversity Sense Check for companies to come in and kind of get see where they're at in their diversity journey. And also a tool to help hold them accountable. So there's other great organizations as well that are doing the work to promote diversifying the research and insight space.
Sounds great. I'll say it again. Insights in Color is the name of it?
Insights in Color.
Okay. Right. Well, we're just about out of time. I think we have time for one more question from the audience. This one comes from Ari. What is your advice for combating clients or colleagues who cite norms as a reason not to be more diverse and inclusive in research? For example, non-binary respondents or setting ethnic quotas to census versus true audience composition. Anyone can take it.
I mean, I think Melva's point I think answers that question earlier about where she noted some extremely terrible faux pas, right? I mean, what good are norms if you're falling on your face? What good are norms if it's not capturing where we're going as a society, right? If we look at Gen Z, it's going to be it is the first generation in history that's non-Hispanic white to make up a minority of that population. And a thing that we haven't touched on is the fastest growing racial group among Gen Z is multiracial. The way that we've built our quantitative surveys right now, we're forcing people into one ethnicity, right? And that's not the future and that's not the reality. So we get this norms question a lot. where people don't want to make changes to survey data because this is something they've collected longitudinally, but bad data in, bad data out, right? So I think the pandemic is a good place to start because consumer behavior is going to change drastically, and this is the time to update the way that we ask questions because we're seeing a huge shift.
Awesome. And then, I have one question, and I'm kind of glad that we brought up the Monkey H&M shirt. Another one that came to mind was the Kendall Jenner Pepsi commercial. And so, when those controversies have happened, I've always sat and thought, who was in the room? Like, was there someone in the room that could have spoke up and said, hey, guys, I think this is a bad idea? And so my last question to the panel is, how do we empower our teams to point out biases that they're seeing? Is there a way for us to develop a culture in which, we're all accountable for each other, and that, someone, whether they're their intern that's sitting there or an individual who doesn't necessarily feel all that comfortable is able to just speak up and say, hey, we've done this research, we've looked at this, but there are some aspects that are external to our research that could potentially make this an issue. I guess to better put, what are some ways that we can empower researchers to voice their concerns when, research is done and they see that it could be going in a way that could be insulting to a group?
I don't know how many of you have been on client side. I was most of my career, as Matthew as well. It comes down to your leadership and if they care. Think about the calculus that was done for Nike to put Colin Kaepernick on the face of a campaign. They weren't worried about a bunch of guys cutting up socks. They were more concerned about people buying $400 tennis shoes, right? So the team that did that at Pepsi, I know, was fired because there was no one in the room to understand that Pepsi does not have the permission. Coke may have the permission. Nike has permission. Pepsi doesn't have permission to do that. And Kendall Jenner and Black Lives, what in the world? But then there have been other instances where what I've heard when the Ancestry ad with the white guy and the slave and love, and it was like, are you kidding? This is not, it's like Sally Hemings was a concubine. She wasn't a mistress. She wasn't a free person to make that choice. And so you can be in the room, but if your leadership doesn't listen, because I have been in the room and I have said, hey, woohoo, you're going to step off the curb, the bus is going to hit you, and then you're going to come back to me and say, why didn't I say something? So I am saying something. And I've gotten two different answers depending on leadership. One, I've gotten, oh, Melva, something rather disparaging about a particular group. You're just, and then it's like, oh shit, really? I'm not, let's pull that back. Let's not do that. Let's like rethink the whole thing. So it really does depend on leadership. So, oftentimes we're the only one in the room. And when you raise an objection, they look around and say, well, the majority is against you. It's like, wait a minute, you have me in the room so that I can basically represent or at least call out, and then I'm voted out because I'm one. So it depends on leadership and it depends on how much you're empowered.
Yeah, we're just about done with time. I really appreciate everyone taking the hour to spend with us. Thank you very much for joining, and a special thank you to our panelists and our host, Pilotly, for inspiring the discussion on this topic. We hope this discussion has been valuable to you and that the perspectives have driven new ideas on how to handle inclusive research moving forward. Everyone have a wonderful rest of the day, and hopefully we can do this again in the future.